Hey guys, Chris Dick here. So today I'm going to talk about OpenAPI documentation again. This will be part 10 of my user services series. And what we're going to talk about specifically is the response bodies. In part 9, we did our request bodies. So in the response bodies, it's very important again to give some description of what's going to come back from your API. Again, good documentation is going to make your API or SaaS service more usable for your users, and that user experience is the paramount of your success. So let's think about what our API currently returns, and we'll start working out from there. Now, the get function, which should just return an array, in this case it's an array of company, currently just says it returns a status of 200, which tells enough, but it's not quite very descriptive. It should tell me what does it look like when it comes back. Give me some ideas on how this actually functions, what information will come back, and how do I consume that. Now, there are a lot of people who will just go off and say, well, let's just try it and see what happens. That's fine, but sometimes you want to have a little bit of understanding before you get it back. And either way, it's always good to give descriptions, and we can do that very easily with the way we've designed this. Now, when we look at the post request, we've got a great response or request body, but here's something interesting. We added a response type of 201 created. However, it maintained the original 200 success, which isn't right. It might return a success of some sort, but it really doesn't. It is actually returning a created because it's creating a resource on the server. So we will make some changes there. We don't need two response types in the success area. Success area, by the way, is in that 200 zone. When we look at our get, it also returns a status of 200, and we're not getting enough information here yet again. It is going to be basically the same information coming back as the get with no parameters, yet it's just going to be one single entity. So we have a couple things that we have to think about in the design sense of when a HTTP method comes in that is a get, we have two choices. We say, is it a get with parameters or is it a get without parameters? If it's a get without parameters, it's going to be an array of some sort. If it has a parameter, it's going to be a single. But we have to make some considerations here as well. The point being is that I can modify what that response looks like, and by doing that I can tell it to give me a specific type of response, and we're going to modify things in our operation filter so that it gives us back enough information from our controller that we can work ahead with that as well. Same with put. Again, we have two response types. We have a 200 for success, which is correct. And we also have an error response, which is 400 bad request. Further, going down here in delete, we have three requests that are coming back. We have a status of 200, 400, and 404. Now, the reason we're not getting a lot of information out of these is because of the way we've coded it. We used our XML comments to give some context around this. So what we're going to do next is we're going to apply some attributes to our actions so that it gives us a little bit more detail. And then from that, we're going to expand out so that we've got more response information that can be injected into the response body. So let's give this a shot. Okay, so we'll go over to our base API user control, and we'll start off with get. So get without parameters. Now get without parameters is kind of an interesting one because we already have a response of 200 coded in here. We could say that it responds with an array of entities like we have here in our summary. However, what we are going to do is we're going to say that it produces a response type. Now the response type is essentially based on the status code that comes back. So the status code that we currently have is status codes dot 200. All right, and from that we can build our example out at that point. Right now, this is essentially going to produce the same information that this response XML actually does. So that's not quite correct. We don't really need it to do that. What we actually want it to do, and there's a different override for this, we can do with a type. What I'll do here is I'm going to fake an array. And all I have to do that is something like this. I just say that it's an object array. It doesn't tell it any more information, but it does tell our response parser what type it is, that it's an array or just a single. If it was just object, in other words, type of object, it would know that it's a single. But because it's an array, we can use that information when parsing out what is going to be expected. So let's move down to get with an ID. Now, our response codes right here, again, say 200. Again, accurate, but not quite enough. So in this case, we are not going to provide any detail around the type because we know that it only requires or returns a single object, and we can continue to use that information. In this case up here, we don't know that it's an array. All we know is that it's returning an object of some sort, but it was just really saying that it's returning okay. So we need more description in the get with no parameters than we do with the get parameters. Right, with parameters, I should say. Now, going through here, we have a post, but this one returns 201. So 201 created. Once again, it requires no extra parameters because it's returning a single object. So we can once again use that information and provide the end user with more detail. Now, on the side of things like error codes, this could produce something like a bad request. At the moment, we don't have it producing a bad request, so I'm not going to add that. So we will think about doing something like that later on when we start dealing with errors. Now, going back over here, the new response type here. Now this is again just status codes dot 200, and that is just fine. Nothing interesting about this, however, we do provide a bad request. So we can say that this is 400 bad request. The other thing that we would also want to do, and I'm going to do this right now, so I'm going to say, given that it already throws an error, the idea is I could throw the error here, or I could just return bad request. But just for sake of process, I'm just going to show you what happens here. So if I did return bad request, that way, this way would actually return more appropriately if something went wrong. So in other words, if I got past our check for IDs and then went to check to see if I had that ID in my list of things or entities, if it returned null, then that means that that ID that I have doesn't exist in my list of entities. So I've done a bad request, or could be even not found. That might even be another one, and we use that error down below. Now, the next thing that we're going to deal with is our delete, and we say that it responds with a success, a bad request, and a not found. Now, you could give more context around the reasons for these actually happening, and that's not a bad idea either. So, if we did want to do something like that, what you could say here is, if it's not found, tell them why it was not found. So where does it happen? Well, it happens at this point because although I got past our ID check, it didn't actually find the entity that we were looking for. So somehow we have a bad ID. And it says not found. I could also return bad request, and that would be fine. So in this case, if I really wanted to produce more documentation here, so I could say the ID used to find the entity was invalid, something like that. So I'll show you what that looks like on the other end. Now, these are basically the status codes that will respond so far. These ones here, Swagger will produce some decent documentation around what those things normally respond with, and it responds with what's called a problem detail. So I'll show you how that works. So let's run our Swagger and find out what it gives us now. All right, here we are back in our Swagger. We've added more response types, and let's see what kind of detail we get back. So our delete had the most detail, so let's take a look at it first. So it gives us a 200 status, which is correct. That gives us a success description. We have 400, gives us a bad request. And then we also have 404, which also gives us a not found. But it's using now our XML definition. And essentially what that's saying here is we can provide a little bit more context around why that error might happen. There's good things and bad things about that. The bad is that it might happen for another reason, but in this case we know that it's going to happen for this specific reason. That's usually the only reason it should happen. Okay, let's run up to our put, and we'll see what it does. It returns a 200 and a 400, doing exactly the same thing it was in our delete. And then get, once again, says 200. No description of what it does, so that's the important thing that we're going to address. And then post will also return a 200, actually 201, excuse me. And this is the important thing that we've been able to make a correction to here. Next, we have our get, and it returns a 200 success, but look what it's done. It's done a nice job at giving us a basic example of what's coming back. So the cool thing here is that because it's doing that, we can use that information now and actually produce something that's going to be very highly usable for our user. So let's go back into our application area, and what I'm going to do now is I'm going to produce another operation filter for Swagger. And in this case, this is going to be using these produces response type attributes. So I'm going to call this entity produces response type example filter. Examples filter, I guess. Okay. So in order to get started, we just add our operation filter, apply the interface, and there we have it. All right, now similar to the way our request body example works, we can build off exactly the same things. We are only going to be working with any interface that has an iUser interface generic type argument in it. In other words, any of our base user API. So we're going to take a few of these parts of code out and just paste them right in. So from here, we can look for the generic type. If we find that generic type, now we've got a type that we can build our examples from. And what I'm going to do as well is I'm going to remove any of the current responses for the status codes that are in the range of 200 to under 300. So anything in that 200s range is generally a status code of OK in some way. So what we have to do is actually remove these. And in order to do that, we have to take the operation and look at the current responses, and we're going to look at that status code, okay? And we're looking specifically at the key in responses. Now, a key of responses means that if you recall, I have a bunch of responses, and a response has basically a status code. That's its key. So a response code of 200 will give a set of things that relate to 200. 400 will give us a set of response content that relates to 400. So with that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to parse the key that essentially should represent an int. If it doesn't, in other words, if there's something that's actually wrong with that, that's okay. It'll try parse, and in other words, maybe it's someone's added in a response that's not valid, or that's not even an ID. That can happen too. So let's think this way. So if we have our response codes, and I want to actually be looking for the status codes that are greater than or equal to 200, and status code is less than 300. Okay. Any of those we want to actually select just the keys from that. Oops. So in that range, we're going to select that into a list because we're going to be modifying the responses. We're pulling that all into memory, and then we're going to iterate over it now and actually remove the responses. So each thing here is a key, and we're saying all of the keys to remove. We're going to actually remove the responses that are unnecessary. Okay. And of course, if everything went well here, we should have less responses, let's say. So we're going to do remove and key. All right, so let's see what this actually does to our Swagger front end. Before we do this, we actually have to add it to our Swagger Gen action, and we simply do this, produces, there we go. We have to add it to our operation filters, and we'll go ahead and run that. All right, let's take a look at our API controller, and what that should have done is removed anything that is a response that is related to 200s. Okay, so we're doing a good job here. Remember, as we move down, we have the responses in the 400s, so we should still see those. Okay, so again, the reason we're doing this is because we're actually removing any of the success versions, if you will, and we're going to provide better examples of those so that we actually have something more concrete. Now, as I mentioned, we're going to be functioning off our produces response type attributes. And because there could be many of those attributes, we're going to ask for the list of attributes that are related to our API description for this context. So when we do that, we're going to go off and look for our attributes. And in order to make that happen, we're going to ask for the API description and custom attributes. And we are looking for specifically those that are of a type of produces the response type attribute. And specifically, we're also going to be applying the same criteria that we did before for our where statement. So we're also saying where the attribute dot status code is greater than or equal to 200 and less than 300. All right. So from that, we can start parsing over each one of those attributes. All right. So in those attributes, I can start to extract certain parts of pieces of information that are going to be very valuable to our implementation of certain um, response types. Okay. Now, there will be a more method extraction or invocation that we're going to do. If you remember over here from the request body example, we actually go out and look for a method. That method was called API request example. And in this case, now we're going to be looking for a response example. Now, the response example will be based on two things. It's got the HTTP method and the status code. So I'm just going to put a public on this, and we're going to copy this one, and we're going to add another static method. So this is a response example. And as I mentioned, it's going to take a status code. Okay, status code in this case is going to equal 200. Now, you may be wondering why I'm using a string here. There's a lot of different reasons, but again, the most important reason is that sometimes the status code may need to be a string for a variety of reasons. I've used strings before, I've used integers before, so I basically go down to the lowest common denominator here. So in this case, let's imagine that I'm looking for what does a get look with a status of 200? So I could be doing something more like this. So if I do status code and then I say case 200 break, okay, I can return something from this point, and that something that it's returned is very simply, I can call that static method up here, right? And I can do this because really a status code of 200 is just going to return the same thing that, let's say, a post would, actually more like a put would. So I'll say this, okay? So that's a simple response that comes back here. We have this request type because it's going to be returning a whole object with an ID and every other part. Now, this is really basic. You can add more detail, obviously, but in the context that we're getting here, it's pretty straightforward. Okay. Now I'm going to be modifying this for our company example. This is at the interface level as well. So I can obviously pivot this on different ways. So I could put the status code switch up top and say, what does each response get? But all I really need to do here, because our post and put actually return exactly the same thing, I can just create a fall through here and simply say that if the status code is 200, return the request example type. Otherwise, it just falls through to null, and same through to delete and default. They're all returning null. So that's one way of doing it. And let's do this. We're going to copy this area down to our company identity. And let's see, let's go to our company right there. Okay, so we have our example of a request right there. Now it's essentially going to do the same thing that it did it did in the interface. So we probably could have kept it there, but I wanted to expand out so you could actually see how this functions within the company context. It's the same as you'll see And by doing this now, we'll have an example at least for get, post, and put. Okay, so let's go back over to our filter. And now we can actually implement that method that I talked about. Now, I'm going to go off and grab some of the details once more here. And that means I'll just grab this. Okay, so that one is going to be asking for the API response. And we also have a different way of manipulating this time. We also need the generic type schema that we had up here as well. So let's grab our schema. And that's because anytime we create a response media, we still need the schema. So we do need that information. All right, so we've got our schema. We also need a description. Now the description is kind of interesting because we can pull, again, using reflection, we can actually pull the description from an enumerable called HTTP status code. Now, this is kind of a neat way of doing it here, and it gives us basically a default description from this type. So what we can look for is, once again, using reflection, we can do the type of okay, system.net.http status code, and look for the status code. In other words, the status code that's coming from our attribute. When I actually run this, I'll show you what's coming back from attributes so you can actually see it. Now, if we actually don't get something that relates to our status code, in other words, maybe we're using a custom status code, we want to give it some sort of definition here. And what I'll do is I'm going to just simply say that this is okay. Okay. Well, probably not. Let's do this here. We'll simply convert the status code over to a string. That is if it doesn't find it, and most of the time it does, so we don't have to worry too much about that. All right, so the next step that we're going to do is we're going to actually build a response based on that. This essentially just gets an instance of a response going here. So we have a response which equals a new OpenAPI response. Okay, and with that we can actually give the description, at least at this point. Okay, so we have a description for our response. Next, we actually need to now request our example from our method that we find here. So let's give some of these things a new name here. So we're going to call this response body. And our method here, as I said, it takes the HTTP method, but it also takes the status code. So we status code, we'll convert that to a string. All right, so if our response comes back with a correct answer, we can then serialize that response. There we go. Just add our JSON libraries, and if we have a response, then we want to actually give it a name here. Oops. I just realized here what I'm looking for here. Now, we actually have to create a media type, and that media type is API media type. There we go. Now, the media type is that that application/JSON content that's going to go in. Okay, so you can create several different media types. Let's say it's a text, maybe an XML media type. You can show any kind of variation of that in order to give it more context for the media type. We're just going to be using the application JSON because that's essentially what we're promoting the use of. But you certainly could add more information to it. So in this example, we're going to use the usual that we've done before, which is an OpenAPI string. It will be using the JSON request body that we created. Let's just give this a new one. So this is now the response body. Give it a new name. Okay. Now, the next thing that we want to do here is now that we've created all this example, we want to actually add this to the response. So we have to add the content. So as I mentioned, content is a dictionary. So we actually have to give it a type or a key, and that key is our application slash JSON. And we're adding the media type in. And there we have it. So unless you specify, like we're serializing this to JSON, but let's imagine you were giving an XML response as well. You could also do that, or even a text response. You have to render it specifically for those types, but you kind of get the idea. All right, now finally, we actually have to add the operation, or add that response to the operation. So here we're going to do operation.responses, and this part here we're actually responding with the status code that we're adding in. So now we've got like a 200 status code is going to give us specifically the key that we need. And again, we convert that to a string, and we're going to add our response. Now, let's see what happens here. I think we've got everything that we need to make this work. Our schema went a little too fast on that one. We do have to add our schema to the media type that we created here. And I think we should be good to go. So let's go for it and try and run this. All right, now we've got our Swagger up and running. Let's see what actually happens. Now for our get, we have an OK response. It's giving us a single object back because we haven't actually told it what to do if there's a different type of interface on it or type of array. So it is giving us an example back. Post is not giving us an example back because we actually specified only 200 status codes. We're going to give it something slightly different, and we'll just add in that status code into our static method there. Now when we look at get is also returning what it's supposed to, so no modifications there. Put should also be correct, and it is also returning our bad request, which is what we expected there. And then delete, because we have no examples, there's nothing that comes back for delete, so we're okay there as well. Now all we need to deal with is our 201 response for our post and the array response. So let's go back into this, and we will make a modification for our company, and I'm going to modify my interface as well. So we have a 200 and 201, and if I go back up to my interface here, I should do the same. There we go. Let's run it one more time and just make sure that we've actually got it correct. All right, here we are. We wanted to take a look at the post action here, and we are now returning an example. That's exactly what we were aiming for, so we did get that correct. Excellent. So let's move on to the next one. We're going to deal now with the array that comes back, and that is a pretty important one to think about here. Now, when we think about the type that comes back, what we need to consider is if it's a type of array that's supposed to be generated back, we need to have a check for an enumerable type of interface that's on the on that type that's coming in. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to have it render out a response. Actually, no, what I'm going to do is this. I am going to do a check for attribute.type. Okay. Now our type, I'm going to do something different here. So I'm going to add in a little check that is going to just test for, is it an enumerable type? So in order to do this, I'm going to very simply create a quick static check. So here is, whoops, static bool, and I was going to say is enumerable type. Enumerable type, yeah. Okay, and it's a type. So with this, I'm going to do a quick check, and using reflection I can do this. Now, you would probably, if in a professional setting, I would have built this into an extension that would have made it much easier to check this, but I'm doing this just for brevity on this as well. It's a much better idea to think that way. So let's see, assignable from. Now, what we're looking to do here is this variable type assignable from, or is it generic? Also, it has to be generic type. And we're saying that is it enumerable with no parameters. Okay, so we're kind of really just testing on all angles of this to make sure that we actually have our correct type. And then we say that is it assignable from type dot get generic type definition. Now, you can see why I'm putting this into a separate function of its own. That's because it's just this big, gigantic thing, and that's something that you'll really want to be repeatable. So now what we'll have here is if we have an enumerated type, what we're going to do is this. So I'm going to have it serialize the default object, which is a singular thing. But if it finds that it is an array type, I'm going to serialize this slightly different. So I can create an array, and just so that we've got it kind of looking like an array, let's put two of those things. So this kind of gives us this nice little ability to expand that object out using an anonymous type, and then serializing that as a array type for JSON. Let's try this out. All right, so let's take a look at our get with no parameters, and we're awesome here. Look at, so now we have an array example that's coming back. We've got two here just for an example to show that it is actually an array, and it's different now from the get down here, which just returns a singular object. All right, so I hope this was helpful for you. This series will continue with a couple more videos. I'm going to produce next a schema filter that will actually remove a few things from the schema so that our users don't have to see them because they're unnecessary fields. That's going to be in my next video. I hope you show up for the next one, and I hope you enjoyed this one. Love you all. Remember to like and subscribe, and be kind with your comments. I love them. Keep them coming. And if you have anything that you also want to see, let me know. Thanks a lot, guys. Bye.